The historical truths that children should be learning, our historical truths, the historical truths of the 99%, are actually quite easy to find in all manner of excellent books, such as Howard Zinn's fantastic People's History of the United States, for example. Or John Newsinger's British equivalent, and equally brilliant, The Blood Never Dried. This particular book is actually a good metaphor for this talk, for it gets its title from the quote that most British people learn in their schoolrooms, that at its peak the sun never set on the British Empire, which was indeed true at one time. But what they seldom learn in their classrooms is the other, more important half of the truth, that the blood never dried there either. Another interesting aside is that the quote Newsinger uses for the title of his book is by an Ernest Jones, a Chartist. Now then, hands up anyone who's ever heard of Ernest Jones, or the Chartists for that matter. Great and real heroes of the 99%. There are plenty of other fine books that teach real and highly important history. Stannard's terrific work, American Holocaust, for example. All right, there you go. That one explodes the myth of ignorant savages living in the Americas prior to the arrival of Christopher Columbus. Or Helen Hunt Jackson's superb account of Native Americans at the hands of the US government, Century of Dishonor. Then there's the Hammond's wonderful trilogy of books set in the time of the so-called Industrial Revolution. These are all called the Town Labourer, the Village Labourer, and the Skilled Labourer. Excellent books, excellent books. And Engels' Condition of the Working Class in England, and the magnificent Making of the English Working Class by E.P. Thompson. Terrific book. Going back a little earlier, there's William Cobbett's very interesting history of the Protestant Reformation. And for more recent history is the historian Mark Curtis, and he's written some great books too on more modern history. Web of Deceit, Secret Affairs, and Unpeople. All of these books examine history from the perspectives of those who suffered its worst effects, or tell a little of the real truth about our trusted leaders. So there's nothing actually secret about the lessons they teach. They're really quite abundant and easily obtainable lessons. But here's the crucial point. These are not the lessons that are taught to small children, and very few adults ever get to learn about them either. Most school children learn the history of the 1%, viewed through the eyes of the 1%, about kings and queens, generals and admirals, emperors and presidents. They never learn very much about their own history, the history of the 99%, viewed through the eyes of the 99%, about the billions of faceless unknown victims of all these great kings and queens, generals and admirals, emperors and presidents. The history lessons that children learn in school are only slightly different from the fairy tales with which they were initially brainwashed. The fanciful stories about fairy princesses and heroic princes, taught in infancy, merge seamlessly into history lessons about real kings and queens. They're the fairy tales burnt by trusted school teachers into the brains of all of us and left there to rot our powers of reason, unless we can find the time and the curiosity and the will to seek out the real truth. And most of us do not ever find that time, because we think we already know all the history we'll ever need, which is exactly what the 1% want us to think. The suggestion that infant stories of Prince Charmings and fairy queens merge seamlessly into the public perception of real-life royalty is easy to prove. All one has to do is look at a public reaction whenever some royal condescends to appear in their midst, especially if the royal in question is a king or queen, or a young prince or princess. No sooner do one of these magnificent people appear at a public function, and all of a sudden masses of people instantly materialize waving their little Union flags. trying to catch a fleeting glimpse of the fairy prince or fairy queen. And it can be seen in the brainwashed eyes of countless thousands who go traipsing around so-called stately homes, gawping in hushed wonder at the stolen plunder of previous generations of one-percenters, little thinking about the monstrous suffering that paid for these lofty cathedrals to greed and the stolen loot that fills them. And surely there's not one single stately home in the whole of England that doesn't have some gruesome tale of bloodshed, slavery, or plunder locked up within its very foundation stones. We should treat all aristocrats and their obscene monuments to genocide and loot with the utmost contempt and disgust, but they are treated instead with star-struck awe, envy, and adulation. Although some of our schoolroom history lessons have some loose connection to reality, it's the reality of the over-pampered 1% we're taught about. Our reality, the reality of the suffering 99% upon whom the 1% are wholly dependent, is almost completely ignored. So what, you may ask? Who cares? That's all in the past. Well, to paraphrase Edmund Burke, those who forget about the horrors of history are doomed to relive them. And there isn't a shadow of doubt in my mind that for all its undoubted technical advances, the headlong race to the bottom in which our trusted leaders have entered us is rapidly steering us back to a period of quite recent history which was truly horrific, the so-called Industrial Revolution, which I'll come back to later. Just one generation ago, life was pretty good, for the average European, anyway. Most people who wanted work could find it, and it paid fairly well too. There was good and free public health care. There was free state education, up to and beyond university level. There was adequate public housing and fairly good public transport. It was far from a perfect standard of living, of course, and all of the public services could have benefited from more investment. But given that it was only a couple of decades since the end of World War II, when much of Europe had been obliterated, it wasn't a bad time to be living. Now, none of these improvements to society was due to the generosity and kindness of kings and queens or the benevolence of great prime ministers or presidents. They were mostly down to the ordinary people of Russia and millions of working-class Europeans who were much impressed with what the ordinary people of Russia had achieved. Exactly the same thing had happened 100 years earlier, as the civil reforms that grew out of the French Revolution had been due entirely to the ordinary people of France, not the pampered aristocracy who bitterly opposed and oppressed them. Across the Channel, the working people of Britain saw the fine example of the French and were deeply inspired to rise up themselves. And it was their actions that led to the social reforms that were grudgingly adopted in Britain during the 19th century, and certainly not through anything the fine kings and queens of the day did, nor any of the other sadistic and useless members of the 1%. Not one of the great social reforms that took place in Britain and Europe in the last 200 years was due to the benevolence of the 1%. They were all entirely due to the growing rage of the 99%. I would like to repeat that point because it's a history lesson of vital importance, a history lesson that no school child ever gets to learn about in school. The reforms that led to the beginnings of a humane society that began to take shape in the aftermath of World War II had nothing whatsoever to do with the benevolence of supposedly great kings or queens, or presidents or popes or emperors or generals, or any of the other supposedly great leaders we learn about in school. The humane society that started to take shape in the 1960s and 1970s was entirely due to the success of the popular revolutions in Europe and in Russia, and the sheer terror felt by the European 1% at the possibility that the ordinary citizens of Europe and the United States, the 99%, would become inspired by the success of the ordinary citizens of Russia and want to copy them. Given the rapid growth of socialism in Europe after World War II, it's plain to see the fears of the 1% were fully justified. As the American editor Edward Dowling once remarked, and I quote, "The two greatest obstacles to democracy in the United States are, first, the widespread delusion among the poor that we actually have a democracy, and second, the chronic terror among the rich, lest we get it."